One of the most distracting things when you're speaking is seeing yourself speaking. You may not have realized it, but that monitor tells you what's on these screens up there. And I'm going to trust that these screens are doing their job, and I'm not going to check up on them, as it were. Although it's one of those nice, postmodern effects that when you're standing in a position like this and you turn around to see who you are, all you see is the back of your own head. Just think about that, because it's quite revealing. And actually there's a lot in there about ministry, but that's perhaps for another time. I meant to say earlier it would help if you brought Bibles with you, but I said that to Bishop Nigel this morning, and he assured me that all his clergy know the Bible by heart, so that's probably okay. But if you do have a text, it might be a good idea to have it. I recall I think it was Professor Robin Scroggs in Union Seminary in New York at the start of one term, when a student said, Professor Scroggs, will we need a Bible for this course? And he said, I think you'll find it'll shed a flood of light on the commentaries, which is... Again, go figure. I'm going to be circling around the obvious passage for confidence in ministry, which is 2 Corinthians 3, 4 and 5, at least slightly extended, 2 Corinthians 2:14 through to 6:11, give or take, which really is the biblical classic passage about confidence in ministry, and a passage which I think we find Paul very much wearing his heart on his sleeve. It wasn't easy being Paul. I know Paul gets a bad press in some Anglican circles, and indeed there's something cultural going on there, a sort of sense that Paul isn't quite our sort of chap. You know, he's not the sort of person you want to be having around to tea when the archdeacon calls in or whatever. It's slightly embarrassing to have him on side, and that's increased by those who find Paul and nothing but Paul just their thing. And sometimes when people get like that, we get a little twitchy about it, and having been a Paul man myself for half my life, I think I know something of that. Though I am reminded of the bishop who said plaintively, everywhere St. Paul went, there was a riot. Everywhere I go, they serve tea. And one bishop says in front row, what is it about our ministry which doesn't cause riots, or should we be worried about that? What was it about Paul that did cause riots? Why didn't they just say, oh, how nice, Paul's in town, have a cup of tea? What's going on? What's going on with Paul? And part of that we see in 2 Corinthians, at least we see by reflection, because at the beginning of 2 Corinthians, Paul tells us how it's been. And before we get to chapter 4, where he says, since it is by God's mercy we are engaged in this ministry, we do not lose heart. That's chapter 4, verse 1. And then repeats it again, chapter 4, verse 16. So we do not lose heart. And it's clear that he's been in a position where he might easily have lost heart. And he knows that, and he wants them to know it. And it's paradoxical he wants them to know it, because part of the problem in Corinth is that they don't want the sort of apostle who might be on the verge of losing heart. They want a hero figure. They want a great leader. I was asked last summer to speak at something called a Christian Leadership Convention, and I went and talked about how the contemporary idea of leadership seems to me a dangerously secular superimposition upon what we actually find in the Gospels and in Paul. And I think a lot in the New Testament subverts some of the language about leadership that gets sloshing around in our society today. But the people in Corinth, the church in Corinth, wanted to have an apostle who was a fine, upstanding sort of person they could be proud of, a person that when their non-Christian friends asked them what this funny new movement was about, they would be able to point to Paul and say, we are following this man because he's so terrific and he's so strong and he does great things and he's such a great leader. And it really hadn't worked out like that. And sadly, the details are lost to us. One of the frustrations of ancient history is just how many gaps there are. And from 2 Corinthians 1, we know that Paul had had a terrible, awful, appalling time in Ephesus. But frustratingly, we don't know the details. He describes it in 2 Corinthians 1, verse 8, 9, 10. Don't want you to be unaware of the affliction we experienced in Asia, it's basically in Ephesus. We were so utterly, unbearably crushed that we despaired of life itself. You're pastors. If somebody says that to you, you're thinking nervous breakdown. utter despair. Indeed, verse 9, we felt we'd received the sentence of death. That's one of the things about depression, that you become judge and jury in your own case, and executioner often. You punish yourself because you're just crushed by it. We've received the sentence of death in ourselves. And then he says, and you can feel him saying it through clenched teeth, so that we would rely not on ourselves, but on God who raises the dead. The resurrection is absolutely central to this. Not as oh, Jesus is alive, so isn't it wonderful, and then everything's all right. No, Jesus is alive, and that means I'm going to hold on by my fingernails, even though death is swallowing me up. We're talking about ministry here. And he who rescued us from so deadly a peril will continue to rescue us. On him we have set our hope, so that he will rescue us again, and you must help us by your prayers. And so much in 2 Corinthians simply grows out of that. It's nothing about ourselves. Left to ourselves, we are absolutely nothing and worse than nothing, and crushable and all too easily receiving in ourselves the sentence of death. Oh yeah, we can fool ourselves after a lovely service or a splendid pastoral visit or whatever it may be, that actually it's all going swimmingly. But then in the small hours of the night, or when suddenly the phone rings and it's like a stab in the side, something else has gone wrong, something has happened, or when you're just horribly aware of your own inadequacies and failures and sheer old-fashioned sin, then you just feel that the whole thing is crushing you. I think it's Michael Ramsey who says in Christian Priest Today, I hope I'm not misattributing this to him because I read it a long time ago, the thing about ministry is that it's far worse than you imagine, as well as far more glorious than you ever thought it would be. I've often said that to ordinands. You see their faces fall at the first one and then possibly rise. But I think we've got to say that to ourselves. Ministry intensifies everything else that's going on. And if there's bad stuff going on, it makes it a lot worse. And if there's glory, then it's hard to beat. So he's talking about confidence, and the confidence clearly is not in himself, but in God, and in the God who raises the dead. But it's confidence born out of this struggle, and his need particularly to restate and rethink his apostleship after it's been challenged. I mean, 2 Corinthians 3 is quite extraordinary, really. Are we beginning to commend ourselves again? Surely we do not need letters of recommendation to you or from you, do we? What's going on? He has founded the church in Corinth. Everything seems to be going more or less all right. You know, they're a funny lot, but then churches are, so fine, that's grand. God is at work. The Spirit is doing powerful things. Then Paul goes back across the Aegean, and he's in Ephesus. And whatever it is happens in Ephesus happens there, and he's crushed by it. And whether because the Corinthians hear about that and are ashamed of him, or whether because new teachers have come in saying, actually, to be a true apostle, you ought to have glory flashing from your every glance. You ought to be able to stride down the street and have people fall on their faces and cry out to God for salvation just as you pass. All this stuff. We can see these false apostles, these pseudo-apostles, these pretend apostles reflected in the mirror we call 2 Corinthians. And so they say to Paul, if you want to come back here, we're going to have a fresh CV, a fresh application, as it were, to let you back. I mean, it's ridiculous. He is their founder. He is their apostle. But they're ashamed of him. And instead of trying to say, actually, you shouldn't really be ashamed of me because I'm still doing some half-neat stuff, he explains to them that the nature of Christian ministry is bearing about in the body the dying of Jesus, so that the life of Jesus may also be manifest in our mortal bodies. He subverts the whole idea of heroic leadership. You know, we have a culture of heroic leadership right now. We have a culture of sporting heroes. We actually, Hello Magazine does it all the time. It replaces royalty, the old-fashioned sort of hero figures in a society, with film stars, with sporting heroes and so on. And actually often it cuts down royalty to the size of sporting heroes and film stars and does the same stuff with them.